Hello, good morning, and or afternoon, as the case might be. Welcome or welcome back, as also the case might be. My name is Dalibor Petrovic. I'm a partner at Deloitte, and I have a distinct pleasure and privilege to be a host of our series of these live webcast interviews entitled Conversations with Tech Leaders Shaping the Future of Canada. Just a quick preamble as we allow our audience members to dial in and join us. This particular series of conversations is intended to present Canada's top-tier technology executives, stimulate conversation between both tech executives representing different sectors, different geographies, different industries. And today, I am thrilled and very privileged to be joined by Lawrence Eta. Lawrence is a Chief Technology Officer of the City of Toronto. City of Toronto, of course, is our largest city in Canada. What people might not realize is that Toronto is actually the fourth largest city in North America, with Mexico City #1, New York, LA, and then Toronto. So a significant, large, important hub. And Lawrence, as you will hear in a minute, leads the technology portfolio for the city, which is a massive, massive organization serving almost 3 million people with over 30,000 employees in the administration and over 1,000 people in the IT portfolio. So a major portfolio, major organization. So I'm very thrilled, Lawrence, and grateful to you to find time to be with us this morning. Before we delve into the conversation, I'm going to actually let you introduce yourself and tell us your story. I wanted to also invite our audience members to submit any questions you might have for Lawrence using our Q&A feature. And then towards the end, I'm going to do my best to ask Lawrence as many questions as we can. So with that, Lawrence, the first question that I always have for all of our guests is to tell us their story. How have you navigated your life and your career to now be at the helm of such a large and important organization in Canada?
And Dalibor, thank you so much for the opportunity. It's great to be on this forum, and you're doing a great work in our country and bringing the leaders and your audience together. So I just want to thank you and your team for that. So it's certainly a privilege being in this position, and to get to this position has a journey and a life that we've all lived. So for your audience, as most people may or may not know who know me, I was born in Nigeria. I lived there till the age of 11 and then moved to the United Kingdom, England specifically, where I was fortunate to graduate with a Bachelor of Science in Technology Management. Went through a sort of typical British boarding school experience. People sort of have the imagery of Harry Potter. That was sort of a bit of my life in terms of going through that. And then I moved to Canada in 1997, specifically Winnipeg. And one of the great things, I found a recruiter online. This was about the mid-90s, 1995, and told me about this place in Winnipeg. I didn't really know much about it. I went and did a bit of research. The internet was just coming together. I landed in Winnipeg on St. Patrick's Day in March of 1997. Wonderful people, warm people. The plate says friendly Manitoba. And there was how my journey sort of started in Canada. Before I came to Winnipeg, I did work for a company called Marks and Spencer's. They're the big UK retailer. Gave me wonderful management training, I must admit, signature training. When I arrived in Winnipeg, I did a role. I was a computer systems administrator for an organization in the sort of industrial space. And then I moved to an internet service provider. And then I worked for one of the big telcos, telecommunications organization. And then it was the early 2000s. I traveled and I went to learn about a device that Nortel Networks was building called the Shasta, which to some of our technical audience, it had a protocol called PPOE, point-to-point protocol over Ethernet. It was the days of now having data and voice collapse. So I came back from California. I said, I came back home and I was so excited. At the time, I said, I've got to move to California, Silicon Valley. So in 2000, I went and I worked for an organization that really was forming what we would call now private internet backbones. We were building point-to-point solutions and a lot of encryption. And at the time, credit cards were coming to be used online. So I spent 3 years in California, San Francisco, the Bay Area from 2000 to 2003 as a network engineer, senior network engineer, testing voice over IP, building networks. And that's my background, network specialist, network engineering. And then I'd moved there with at the time, I got married a local person from Winnipeg, still in my life, my wife, and we went through this journey. And then we came back to Canada for some family reasons. And I went and joined Manitoba Telecom Services, which I'd left. And we started looking at video in terms of, that was when the telecommunications companies were really providing access in terms of into the broadcast TV space now. So some of my backgrounds on internet protocol, building large networks really worked well. Deep inside of me, as I said, I did a degree called technology management, but I've always been fascinated with business. So I did an MBA, did a master's of an executive MBA, and I did a master of management because I was very interested about the people and the business side. So key aspects of finance, economics, those sort of pieces were very interesting to me, and really leading teams. So I spent time with Manitoba Telecom, and then there was a real career pivot where I got a job as the head of technology for a company called Healthcare Employee Pension Plan. I was their director of information services and started moving into the enterprise, moving more into the Oracle environments, the ETL world, the extract, the transact, the load, the databases. And we were building, at the time it was getting online. We didn't call it digital back then, it was getting online. So I spent some time, so I was back in Winnipeg for about 6 years, and Winnipeg is a great city. My in-laws live there. We spend at least a couple of times, but I wanted a bit of a change of a climate. So let me just put it that way. So my wife had gone to Vancouver and said, look, Vancouver looks good. So we moved, we relocated to the West Coast, where I took a position in a company that was called Themis, and it was owned by an American company called Maximus, and they were in the business processing outsourcing space, child support, collecting payments. The average child support payments were about $200. The government had outsourced it to a private sector in BC about 20 years ago. So we started working on that, and that's when I really got into, and this is another pivot moment, the human services side of my journey. I started becoming very interested on the human services, child support, employment center. So we won contracts open. And then I spent a stint all over the US. I worked on the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare launched in terms of, we were rolling out call centers. We rolled out a call center, big call center. I was now traveling, road warrior, doing all those things and going through and really big enterprise. And so after being on the road for 3 years, traveling between Vancouver, Toronto, Memphis, Chicago, all these areas, I needed to come home. My wife wasn't seeing me. So I came back, I worked on a small startup called Districts Industrial Internet of Things, started getting into the IoT space. And then a former colleague of mine who used to be in Vancouver, moved to Ontario, said there's this job in the city of Toronto called the Deputy Chief Information Officer for Infrastructure. We think that, give it a call. So I thought about it. I thought Toronto's a big market. I mean, it's the province, is a big area. But I went through a journey and I ended up in the city as the Deputy Chief Information Officer in 2017. And then fast forward 2 years later, had the great opportunity to be appointed. We changed the title from the CIO, Chief Information Officer, and it became the Chief Technology Officer. And that's been the journey of landing here. So I did navigate very strategically technology. I wanted to be certainly good at that space, but the business, the people, the leadership side is what navigated me. And I think Toronto and myself found each other at the right time. I think Toronto was ready in terms of bringing certain leadership together. And I was ready to sort of take on a challenge. Fast forward 4 years ago, maybe not really knowing the length of the challenge in now the pandemic, but that's been my journey.
And what a wonderful journey it is. So congratulations, Lawrence, on that. What I take away from this like we do have variety of different profiles that end up being in very senior technology leadership roles. We've interviewed people who are lawyers, who are engineers, who are, completely out of technology. You actually are a technologist.
Yes.
And you are a technologist by training and by trade and profession. And I think that from listening to your story, how you differentiated yourself into the leadership roles by being very explicit about desire to learn about business, getting your MBA degree. And that, would you say that really changed that trajectory?
100%. I felt I needed credibility to be very strong technically. That was my view.
Yes.
So by being a network engineer, computer systems engineer, administrator, point-to-point protocol, Internet of Things, I needed to learn the chops of that. I felt that when I was now having conversations with the team, there was a credibility. And that's not to say you can't come from a different background, but the world of tech is very deep and technology. But I did recognize that I wanted to round. So things like finance, an executive MBA, finance, human resources, because in our role now, and I know we're going to talk about that, the role of the CIO, CTO is the central point of it all. I go into, and one of my great mentors said to me, he was an engineer and he had an MBA. He was in Manitoba, in Winnipeg, which was a great mentor. He said, I go into a meeting, it's like a toolbox. Am I having a conversation on finance now about the numbers? In Toronto, it's a very large budget, very large capital operational, weighted average cost of capital. You got to talk money. Is it about culture? Is it about people? I felt that the MBA and some of the journey I've had in many cities would round me. It's always about the rounding, as well as the political acumen. And I'm not just talking about the politics of an elected politician, but it's the cultural political acumen. So that was very prescriptive for me in my career. It wasn't by chance. I navigated that because I felt that the role would exceed from just being back office to somebody that had to start to be the front and the face as we navigated this very complicated world with technology as a centerpiece.
That's a wonderful advice for those in the audience who are contemplating similar moves. I think this is very, very important to hear this validation, I think, of the importance of having that skill and muscle, in addition to being technology savvy. So Lawrence, now that you have this large portfolio, leading technology portfolio for the city. And by the way, I do want to ask you at some point the difference between the rationale between changing the title of the role from CIO to CTO. But let's park that for a second. I'm curious to know, at this level, what are sort of the obstacles you are facing? What are the exciting things or opportunities that you're pursuing? Sort of what's happening at the city that you think would be noteworthy to share with our audience?
Yeah, there's some great things. Of course, like all of our audience, we've had to deal with this pandemic. So I get appointed in October 2019. 6 months later, there's the pandemic. So one of the big things is that, how did we rally to ensure that we could do remote work, like most people, right? So at the bad snow day, the city of Toronto could handle 1,000 people walking. So within that 30,000 plus walkers, only 1,000, there's about 11,000 of people that we call office walkers, us in the office, because of course we've got our great colleagues who are walking in shelter, walking in parks, forestry, and recreation, etc. But we had to, in 6 weeks, we were able to accelerate the city to move to an ability for 10,000, 11,000 people to walk remotely. So that was an instant challenge.
Yeah.
And there. Another component that came is the equity and inclusion. And I know we'll talk about that. I started getting calls with, normally, traditionally, the position would look more inside the enterprise. But I started getting calls from various officials about internet access, affordability, high speed. So we had started to walk about the evolution from smart cities to connected communities. How do we bring communities connected with devices? So that became a real big piece. Another thing was the partnership. You can't do it alone. Yep. So there was a lot of relationships that in my 2 years as the DCIO that I built with some of our service providers to pick up the phone and say, we need to enable this big city from a digital technology. We need your help. So the relationship became really important in navigating that. And then the culture. Toronto is a very complex environment. 44 divisions, large government. I define it as some principles. So quickly, what I recognized to immobilize or mobilize my team was to ensure we built the 4S's. 4S's. So the first thing was that we created a operational center that was the heartbeat in terms of emergency management. And we met every day and sometimes into the weekend. But the principles that we've built on was everything we do must be stable. So any technology has to have stability. Without stability, we're done. Everything we do must scale. So we have to scale from 1,000 people remotely to 11,000. Everything we do must have a solutions architecture. I'm a big one for enterprise architecture. And by all means, we had great public service people that were working so hard. And we had great private sector that was emailing me about various platforms that could solve various problems. I understood that. But if we brought all these platforms into the city and we transitioned, then we wouldn't have integration. So what I ensured that we had solutions architecture that links into enterprise architecture. So that was the third S, solutioning that was integrated. And that's probably my architectural background. Then the fourth S was sustainability, making sure it's secure, making sure that once we've built these things, how do we keep it refreshed, life cycle management. So those were our principles. Another principles that I work on to help a lot of aspects of equity, inclusion, modernization, digitization is the PEST, P-E-S-T. Mm-hmm. Political in terms of navigating the city, both from an elected standpoint as well as colleagues. Economic, so all of a sudden now, how do we pay for these things that weren't budgeted in 2019, right? Yeah. No one could foresee that. Socially, the relationships with my other colleagues across the city, up, down, across, 360, and technology. So the 4S principles and the PEST were foundation in trying to digitize. And we've had some tremendous success. We just released the largest North American 311 call center implementation utilizing our Salesforce platform and a systems integrator in Catalyst. We went live. It was announced by the mayor on Monday. Largest, huge service, omni-channel, allowing the residents to go on our website. Huge. We rolled out immunization clinics. So there was a lot of technology involved. We built in 6 weeks our coronavirus case management system, working with the provincial government to help our chief medical officer in terms of how we're looking at cases. We put a lot of digitization. So for example, people would come into City Hall to ask for marriage license. We changed the regulations, put that online, and it goes on and on. And that occurred because of the principles for us on the 4S's, it occurred on PEST, and tremendous leadership, and also a team that bought into our vision before the pandemic. They bought into our strategy. The city has a technology strategy that's based on 80% in the cloud. We had that 20% on premise, data centralization, enterprise risk management, which is also about the cybersecurity and the risk management, the physical risk, the digital risk, P3, private-public partnership. And then the fifth piece of the strategy is I don't even call it the change management, but the evolution management. So one of the key things we did was collapse infrastructure and application under one deputy, because the client doesn't care whether it's the infrastructure or they don't care in the application. So what they care is about the service delivery. I also changed the name of the division from information technology to technology services delivery. Every area in my division has a delivery. We can talk about what we want to do, but the measurement of success is what have you delivered? Yeah. So the delivery aspect is very important. So we have a deputy chief technology officer who's running the delivery. We have a deputy chief who's running the architecture delivery. So those are sort of the things that sort of helped galvanize the team to where we are today in Toronto from a technology and an enablement standpoint.
This is extremely impressive. I think that a lot of people in the audience who are not in public sector would be, I think, pleasantly surprised to hear and realize how many things are actually happening and how much things are being accomplished. So this is fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing and for giving these pointers. I think the PEST concept, the 4S concept, that's very applicable everywhere, right? So it's really great to hear you say that. Maybe now with the time, I think that's you mentioned you rebranded and retitled the division department.
Yes.
Can you give us a little bit more? Maybe this is the time you can answer the change in the title as well. How do you see
Definitely.
CIO versus CTO, which is the role the title you now have? Yeah.
Yeah, we did some consultation both, inside the city and outside the city with stakeholders. And the essence, just in terms of the outcome, we wanted to send a message because in the city we have division ITs as well, divisional groups that run their own IT, and there's an oversight that certainly I have. But we wanted to send a message to the city of Toronto, the industry, that the reason of changing to the CTO was to demonstrate that the chief technology officer role came from a tech and was deep into tech. Not the only piece, relationships and culture, but we felt that it was a way to send a message of the rebranding, that by bringing all these interoperable, the leadership, both also to the staff and to our colleagues, that the role was going to be as well very strong on a tech background. So it's not to say that the CIO role doesn't have that, but we felt that it was a time and a rebranding was required. So once that title was changed, we also considered other titles: Chief Innovation Officer, Chief Innovation Technology. There was a lot of different titles considered by the senior leadership of the organization. So we landed on CTO to really push forward in there. So once that title was done in October 2019, I then, I'd spent 2 years in terms of the city before that. I then felt that as a refresh, it was also important to change the name to reflect the T of the title: technology, Chief Technology Officer, technology. I felt that the name services was to send a message to our clients. We are here to serve. We're public servants, but we also have internal and external candidate.
Yep.
And so that was the genesis. It was very constructed. It was very well thought out in terms of the approach. And a lot of the times, branding efforts, and I'm sure there's some on this call who have great expertise in marketing, what are you trying to brand and what is the culture you're trying to drive through? And that was the reason we changed the title as well as changing the division names in that.
That's very good. And what I sense from now having this conversation about you're very deliberate in moves. They seem to be very well thought out, very well structured, and very deliberate. And that's fantastic. You have navigated this career as a technologist very successfully. And I would love to get your perspectives on the evolving role of Canada tech leaders. What have you experienced? Have you experienced fundamental changes in the role? And where do you think this role is actually heading?
Great question, Dalabo. And the first answer is yes. I think the pandemic has demonstrated technology leaders are not just a back office. We are actually on the macroeconomics, and maybe I'm bringing a little bit of my executive MBA. You have micro and macro, you have supply and demand, you have the reason of when oil prices change and move into climate change and some of those aspects. Technology leaders now are the best placed. Some may feel that it's a biased comment, but we're right in the middle. Yeah. We're right in the middle for the culture. We're right in the middle for business process reengineering, finance. We're right in the middle because these days we are digitizing our world. There is nothing you can't do without technology. So our roles are, as well as the back office component, our roles are really helping Canada in terms of the innovation group. And I'll give an example. So I sit on a group and a plug for a group called CELA, which is the Coalition of Innovation Leaders Against Racism, which I had the pleasure, based on some relationships with great partners across, to be part of this group that was founded in 2020 in the prefaces of when the George Floyd. But it's really trying to say The tech leaders are the innovation and engine for us to transition our economy that is not so much focused on one component, but really innovation. And we see that in Toronto. Toronto is a global leader for tech. So I see our role now taking a mantle on the world stage that starts to talk about diversity and inclusion, how we solve the climate problem, how we ensure that we're diverse in our economy, how we deal with certain aspects that includes inclusion of workforce, the future generations of the newcomers and the immigrants that are coming to join us, about the roles. And I see that the technology role is that. Now we have to earn our seats at the table. I think we've done that, we're doing that. And your series, I'm sure with others you've been speaking to, there are talented and very, very skilled tech leaders who are navigating past technology, even though their title says CIO, CTO, or tech leaders. So our role is definitely to bring economic prosperity, social equity, inclusion, diversity. That's the role that I push to position. But it first comes with ensuring that you can keep your house, you are delivering. To get credibility, you need to deliver. Once you deliver, then you have a broader mandate to be able to help the country, help the city, and help the community grow.
Excellent. Excellent. And what I would agree with you 100%. And what I think is important, what you're mentioning, is CIOs are actually in a unique spot. And let's pick sustainability. Let's pick inclusion and equity. CIOs can certainly lead the way and operate a greener IT department. They can certainly lead the way in establishing a more inclusive leadership group within IT. They can be the ESG engine, but they're in a unique position to actually then step out of the department and demonstrate how information and technology can actually enable the rest of the enterprise to be more sustainable, more greener, how to equip management with insights of knowing how to manage inclusion and equity, right? So it's almost a dual role. That's a very unique proposition, because IT is probably the best positioned today to do this. Not only can your house be in order, but you can actually enable the rest of the building to actually fall in order as well. So this is very, very, very good. And as you say, through that, we are moving the needle for our communities, for our society, ultimately for this great country that we all share.
Absolutely. And I sit on some tables for a plug. For example, I sit on the GTAH table, the Greater Toronto and Hamilton, with other leaders. I sit on the table with other CIOs across the countries for the big 6 cities. Toronto is a very large contribution of the GDP in Canada, but it's a big ecosystem. So I sit on a table with Vancouver, Calgary, Ottawa, Edmonton, as well as, in terms of us in Toronto and Montreal. But we're also bringing the prairies into that table. So we sit the leaders, the tech leaders from areas of Winnipeg sit on that table. We also have areas of Halifax. So what we're trying to do is build this cohort, this group of certainly government leaders in that respect. I also sit, and we're through the CIO Strategy Council, which has the private sector on there, which with big tech, and also, with other groups in terms of other areas, in terms of Tech Nation. And what it really is shaping the landscape. So when we come to things like digital identity, how we solve in terms of privacy and security and cybersecurity, also with the tables of the Chief Information Security Officer. So my counterpart, I give a plug, I have a colleague who's the CISO on the City of Toronto. But these are roles now that is really talking broadly about how do we solve a lot of these aspects, and how do we ensure that the great success story of Canada is reflective on the leadership as well. So that's why the diverse and inclusion, the more of the 2.9 million people in the City of Toronto see that the leadership is diverse and inclusive, it's there. And I'll give an example. In my senior management team, my 2 deputy chief technology officers are women from an inclusive and a diverse background. That was purposely reflected on, so we could show that there are great women tech leaders. and they've joined us, great careers, and they're doing tremendous leadership. So I think you have to be purposeful in your approach, and you have to be able to demonstrate that you can build the relationships and set the culture that is not about you, but about the greater good, the greater good.
Exactly.
And I define it with sort of three components. What is the succession planning is very important in everything I do. The DNA is, what is the succession planning of every levels in our roles? What is the legacy that is the CTO and my colleagues we want to leave in the city of Toronto when our time is there? And also, what are the outcomes that we can demonstrate to the public and to our elected officials and to the residents and to our communities that the reason we are here as technologists is making a difference? So succession planning, the legacy you leave, the outcomes that is reflected on the investment of the taxpayers' dollars. Those are sort of another three aspects that help govern the way that I certainly approach this role in terms of ensuring that there's something I can look back. I can look back and say, I remember when we moved to the cloud. I remember when we collapsed 3 data centers into 2. I remember when we launched the largest CRM, customer relationship management platform. I remembered when we provided high-speed internet in terms of donations. I remembered when our partners worked with us. I want to be able to look in that in a few years' time and say, I was one piece of a larger ecosystem. And I think that that's what we have to drive as tech leaders in terms of our DNA and our ethos in how we lead.
I absolutely love that philosophy. Lawrence, obviously, you and I met through the CEO Strategy Council, and so I have heard your perspective there. This is why I really wanted to sort of poke into this question, because it is really very inspirational and encouraging to hear from you and colleagues of yours that we interview, that similar sort of perspective, that this cannot just be about delivering efficient, effective services. There is a bigger play here. There is a societal play here. There's a community play here. We have a role and we have the levers to pull to improve inclusion and equity and build the next generation of talent that will continue making this country the best place on the world to live in, right?
Absolutely.
So this was wonderful to hear, and thank you for all your contributions on that front. There was an interesting question that came from the audience about your advice to young women specifically, and I'm going to jump right there because I hear and see your passion, and you are doing things to improve the inclusion and equity of your teams, and you're very, very, very well now known for that. What would be your advice to young women? Specific question came out, who aspire to become technology leaders and have families and need to find a way to balance both. Anything you can share
Absolutely.
there?
Absolutely. And we hear the mentor and sponsorship, and I just want to, and it's certainly overstated, but I just want to, my advice is this: the mentor is very important for the women, to ensure that they have mentorships that can help them navigate that pest. Especially, the mentors will give advice. The sponsors are the allies that help elevate the women in those roles. So, for example, if we are going to have forums whereby I definitely have to be a sponsor for my deputy chief technology officers. For example, there are certain things that I ask to get to speak on. Of course, you can't be there, but I would rather defer to my colleagues who, number one, are excellent in this space, but also they're leading this space. So sometimes it could be the CTO to speak. Well, my deputies run very large areas. So my advice is that really find the connections of sponsors. And there's lots of social media. That sponsor doesn't have to be necessarily in your organization. Some people may know I'm not as much, but I certainly post on LinkedIn. That's my forum of social media. It's just that there's only so much hours to sleep and to manage my family life. And I've been raised by great women. I've been raised by great women, and I have great women in my life, especially with my wife helping. So they give me advice.
Mm.
They give me advice. My wife is in human resources. So it's really about allyship and sponsorship. So I would say to the women, find a really good mentor that you have a connection with. They don't have to be in your sector. They don't have to be in your industry. I've had people who've reached out to me on LinkedIn that I never knew, and they've just made a connection. So I would say that for sponsors, and then let's elevate the narrative, and the more people, I'll finish this on a practical example. And it's not just to women, it's about diversity and inclusion. So recently I was attending a meeting, and it was actually yesterday, and the meeting was going to present to some very senior people. And it was an initiative in terms of an initiative that's had a restart, a reboot. It stopped and starts, and there's been various reasons. And I wanted a director who reported to one of our leaders to come with me. It had to be a small audience. My role there was to set the scene, but the director presented. That director could be a woman. But I wanted to create an environment of support, because the role of the allyship was to use my role, my relationships, to create a supportive and a healthy environment. There's nothing wrong with feedback, but it's how the feedback is delivered of the culture. It's the how. So that sponsor, it's about the how. So what I say to the women out there, find the mentor, find the sponsor in and out of your organization, be proactive, search, see what people post. If you really like, you're seeing somebody post something, or the way they're coming across on social media or in forums virtually, reach out to them. The worst they can say is they don't have enough time, but you may get a connection that says, let's connect, and then investigate, probe in terms of the journey. So that's the way that I feel that you have to be very prescriptive. And once you start doing that, you elevate more women. I'm the only man in my senior management team. I'm the only man, but I learn everything every day, and it's not purposeful. We can have, other men, but there's certain part of the contribution, a diverse and inclusive, my female leaders bring to me, that allows me to be aware. I also have a program manager role, who's a woman, who will say to me, be aware of this person, they're feeling a certain way. So I come into the office now 1 day a week. I'm actually having this in the office. And I spend part of my days, my office opens up my calendar, because we want to touch base with the others who are coming in. And it could be with a face-to-face. So the allyship, the mentorship, and the sponsorship is my advice to women leaders, and really be very prescriptive of how you seek that connection.
This is very good. This is gold, Lawrence. This is very practical, usable. And I think the undertone here is that you are not alone. It takes a village, but you need to take steps to actually identify and bring those ally sponsors and mentors. That's excellent. Lawrence, I have actually the same question that came from an audience member. Is you have spoken so eloquently about so many different things that you are spending your time on. How do you balance your priorities and your time so to still be able to perform at your peak? Are there any tips that you can share with us about how do you approach?
Yeah, definitely. So through the pandemic, I used to, and maybe I'm going to go more on the health, because mental health is important, and we all have that. So through the pandemic, before the pandemic, should I say, I was a very early riser. I've always been, one of the things, I'm very disciplined. I'm very, because I believe, we've had, there's the book out there that says, 10,000 hours and you repeat. So I'm a great student of, if you repeat and you do things well, you don't have to be perfect, but after a while, you can become an expert if you invest certain times, not necessarily just from an education standpoint, but discipline. So one of the things I started recognizing, actually, when I joined the city of Toronto, while I was leaving Vancouver, I made certain lifestyle changes just in health. So for example, I used to wake up very early. I used to, be very disciplined, take care of health. But one of the things through the pandemic is that, and this may be interesting, and I'm not sure if this has been talked on your podcast, but I now start doing certain things of mindful meditation.
Yeah.
I do yoga in the morning. there's a level set I do. My days start very early, similar to that. It's not surprising I'm having a 7 a.m. meeting very early. It's not surprising I'm on the phone till 9 or 10 sometimes. It's just the nature there. So I level set myself in the morning. I take that sort of serenity to just gather myself, because as soon as the light camera action sets, it's WebEx to WebEx, meetings to meetings, conferencing. So that's the first thing. I take care of my health. I make sure I made certain adjustments in terms of my nutrition to help me give energy. So I went from a certain way of my nutrition. And that was because I felt that there was a certain energy level of a pace that was going to be needed. Sleep became very important. I started sort of, using my tracker to track how much sleep. So those are some of the health area. And also, then I try to surround myself and make sure that I'm in surroundings where the energy, I said to somebody, there's only so much energy. So I'm very compartmentalized about how much energy are we spending. So when I come in, I'm very prescriptive to say there is a level of energy that's going to be very strategic today. I have to have certain conversations to be able to influence 360, up, down, across. So where's that energy going to be there? So I look at my calendar and I prepare how my energy is going to be spent. And then there's the curveball that comes in every day, right? And then another thing that I've been starting to do, which actually was suggested with my wife, is that I started keeping a journal. So during the day, something may pop up or might come into a meeting where I was like, oh, there was a nugget. And I'll give an example. So there is an area where we have the Confronting Anti-Black Racism in the city. It's led by the mayor has provided great leadership. We've also provided great leadership through the deputy mayor, Thompson, and some great officials. So Toronto is big in terms of that area. So I was in a meeting that was supporting the Black Staff Network. And there was a comment that was made about how do we ensure people, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, rise and have opportunities in the organization. And somebody mentioned something, the 3 E's. And I'm not sure if you've heard about this, Dalabo. So as people of color, you can have the education, which is the first E. You can get the experience, right? And that's what we're talking about, moving through different roles. Exposure, which is really linking to also advocating for women. So those 3 E's I learned. So I jotted it down in a journal, the 3 E's, right? So the way I try to keep it is that I am every day coming to continuous learning. And one of the ways I balance is that we've recruited and retained talent. We are deep in talent. So for example, I recognized that we needed good software development, software engineering. We have a lot of the things I've talked about, we've built in-house in the city. We've built in-house. So surrounding yourself with really good, deep talent in this very difficult competitive as a public servant is not easy. So health, mental health, physical health, good advice, journaling, surrounding yourself with talent, that's what helps me in this big, and this is a big DNA of a place. It's a big ship. It's as big as a provincial government. The city is massive. The pressure is constant. So with having those sort of pieces helps me keep level set. And I'll finish off on this. It has to be about joy and happiness. And I hope that is coming across. If it is no joy, it's a grind. So I try to find the energy with, how can I go into this meeting that I'm going to come about progress, not perfection, and I'm going to feel joyful, even though sometimes it's difficult. And that's the way I try to manage my mental health and travel and family. We got a COVID puppy. I take my dog for a walk. I know that this is a CTO conversation I'm going off, but I listen to podcasts, a Harvard Business Review podcast. We talked about it. Spotify is not just about music. I listen to various topics. I'm always constantly wanting to learn, to improve, so that I'm ready to provide Toronto and the people that have entrusted me in this role and my family to do the best, and also to take time for myself. So that's how I try to do it.
Lawrence, this was absolutely fantastic. I have learned a lot. I know the audience did too. Clearly, you are an athlete and a master of your art and science, and I think this shows the passion shows and positivity shows. And I soaked energy. I am the energy bunny, but I soaked energy from you on this conversation. I also want to be very mindful and respectful of your time. So we are now at time, Lawrence, on behalf of the CIO Strategy Council, who is co-hosting this series with me and with us from Deloitte. Thank you very much for your time. I am going to go back and listen to this recording because there are nuggets here that I can take and learn from. For the audience members, thank you all very much. I look forward to seeing you back next week, next Wednesday. We'll have a great guest in Shannon Archibald, the newly appointed Deputy CTO at Government of Canada's Shared Services Canada, another very successful female technology leader. So with that, I hope to see you all back same time next week. Lawrence, again, much appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dalabo. Thank you very much, Deloitte, the CIO Strategy Council. And thank you to all your guests who tuned in today and those that would listen to this. It's an honor. And thank you to all the residents and the taxpayers of the City of Toronto for entrusting in us as public servants. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.